Welcome back to another episode of That Interview. Today is the conclusion to the special two-part interview with Jessica Swann. Today we'll be discussing Muslims, terrorism, Islam and fake news. The big things. This is That Interview Show. Okay, welcome back. So obviously I'm Julian, this is Jessica Swann. We're talking about, in this particular episode, understanding Muslims and Islam and fake news, because it's the big thing to talk about.
Love that.
Yeah, so, alright, so I've only got a few brief things, but mainly just for my own understanding. So I'll start with, of course, well, where are we now exactly?
We're actually in the Faith Centre at Swinburne University. So this particular area that we're in, this is obviously just a meeting room, but the prayer area, and it is Friday, so Friday is a holy day for Muslims. So what's called the Dhuhr prayer, so the midday prayer, is about to be called at 1:45 today. And they have two sessions here at Swinburne University, so we may be lucky enough to hear the prayer call.
I've still got 40 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, we're on the third floor at Swinburne's Interfaith Centre.
Cool. Alright, so help me understand Muslims, Islam and terrorism to the best of your ability.
Yeah.
Alright, well I guess firstly, why, we obviously know why they call, the media call Muslims terrorists, but, well, from your experience in Dubai,
yeah.
What can you actually say about them in a better light?
Sure.
To paint them as a realistic picture.
Yeah, gosh. Look, there's just so much to say. It's a little bit like, it's really interesting because imagine if someone was to reverse this and say, what have you got to say that's good about Christians? Or what have you got to say that's good about Jews or Buddhists or something like that? It's really interesting when we shift the focus onto another group of individuals that align themselves with a particular world religion. We just wouldn't do it in that way. You know, we understand in a Christian context that, gosh, you know, a Russian Orthodox is different to a Greek Orthodox, it's different to a Catholic person, different to an Anglican, different to Uniting Church, and so on and so forth. And then all the different shades of all the other different aspects of Christianity in between. So we know that Christians are not one homogenous group. You know, you can be a Christian who has a strong faith in God, that goes to church every Sunday. You can be a Christian who's never been to church. You might have just been baptised or christened when you were a baby. You can be someone who, has Christmas and has Easter and, you can be a Catholic who happily is on the contraceptive pill despite the fact that that's against the Christian and Catholic belief. But we know that there's diversity in all of that. We know to see individuals from an individual perspective and not to look at Christians as all one homogenous group. But it's very interesting how that's not what happens with Muslims. So when we think about Islam and Muslims, they are one group. And that is a very interesting narrative that's been driven for about the last 100 years. And the only way we can truly understand why do we in the West see Muslims as one particular group, and we don't see the varying shades of diversity, the 200 odd nationalities that make up Muslim nations around the world, the fact that the largest Muslim nation is in Indonesia, just above us, 202 million there, less than 20% of the world's Muslims are Arab. The vast majority live in the Asia-Pacific region and not the Arab world. And so there's a lot that we don't understand about Muslims and a huge amount that we don't understand about Islam as well. And the question therefore is, why? Why is that the case? And the only way that we can truly understand this is to understand a concept called Orientalism. Orientalism is a term that's given to the way I say collectively we, as Western or European minds, how do we understand the other? How do we understand the Orientalist, the Oriental? That's how Arabs were described back in the days of colonialism. So when the French and the Brits were on their big colonialist endeavour, so obviously the Brits got Australia, although the French did circumnavigate this area too. When we look at Europe, when we look right across the Middle Eastern region, all of these areas, and of course India and Pakistan, and all these areas have been largely part of the colonial project. Who's going to own it? Who's going to control it? So whilst that was very much about nation states, as in I'm going to have this land here, this is going to be mine, and you can have that one over there, that can be yours because you're French, and this can be mine because I'm English. Drawing up of nation states, that's the physical aspect of this. There is another aspect of this, which is the Orientalist narrative. How have these people been portrayed over time and over 100 years of this narrative? How do we understand Arabs? Well, certainly not the Arabs and Muslims who speak for themselves. We're the ones who speak for them. We're the ones who put our lens on. Oh, look at the barbarians. Oh, look what they're doing. Oh, my goodness, look at that one there. So we understand this part of the world, and we understand different cultures in this respect, whether it be the Polynesians, because there were certainly huge conquests of the Asia-Pacific region, and a lot of these Polynesian communities and what have you. There was certainly, a lot of colonisation there, and a lot of colonisation of a lot of the tribes right across the continent of Africa, right across what's called the Maghreb region, which is North Africa. So Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, right down into Ethiopia and many of the other countries there, right up into Syria and Lebanon, or what is now Lebanon. There was no such thing as Lebanon until 1920. That was Greater Syria. So that was all part of the carving up of that region as well. So in order to carve up this region, there had to be a story that went with it, that meant that we as people and as a society endorsed this kind of domination, world domination. And that's the Orientalist project. We are still living in the hangover or the legacy of that Orientalism. So why do we collectively see Muslims and Islam in a particular way that is extremely narrow? It is extremely misrepresentative, and it is driven by stereotypes. And we see it in that particular way because that's how we were supposed to see it. That's how we've learned in our history books. Through Hollywood, the vilification of Arabs, which is really no different to the vilification of Jews or the vilification of African Americans and so on. So there's a big narrative that goes on here. And unless we actively seek out the truth, or unless we actively seek out other meanings or another side to this, generally speaking, we're not going to see things independently, because that's how the media functions. There's a framing effect, there's an agenda, and when that agenda and framing effect has been going on for 100 years, including the omission of very, very important points in history where there was the carving up of these nation states, and we only see these people in a particular way written by white English men over history, then we will continue to see them in that way, and we still see them in that way now.
Yeah.
But the people, Muslims are amazing people, and Arabs are amazing. I mean, the traditions, like many cultures around the world, you're talking about an ancient tradition, ancient cultures in the Arab world. You're talking about Mesopotamia. You're talking about the bringing together of two of the great rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates in what we now know as Iraq, which was formerly Baghdad. And you're talking about what we now know as Lebanon, which was Byblos. And Alexandria has always been Alexandria because that's always been one of the great empires. Egypt has always been a great area of scholarly endeavour and so on. But these cultures are so old and so beautiful, and the respect that they have for one another, and just the hospitality and the honour and the dignity that exist within these cultures is a narrative that we've never heard. We just hear of the Arab with the big nose. We hear about the Arab who's really into, your blonde-haired, blue-eyed Western girl, the sexually, sex-starved Arab and the bomb-throwing terrorist and the dirty taxi driver and so on. That's all we hear. But I can absolutely tell you it couldn't be further from that in my personal experience, having lived now in a number of different Arab and Muslim majority countries.
Yeah. It's actually much trickier to ask questions when I only have prompts to go along with.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we could go into what is Islam exactly?
Well, Islam is a world religion, obviously, as we know. Islam is the third in a trilogy. So think of it like Harry Potter books or something like that. That's how I like to describe it. So it is an Abrahamic tradition. So Abraham was a prophet that was around many, many, many years ago. So Abraham was the first one, and he was the father of these three great religions. So Abraham came about, and then there was Judaism with the Torah under Moses. It was Christianity under Jesus with the Bible. And then 600 years later came Islam with the Quran under the Prophet Muhammad. They are all the same thing. So I'll say a few names and you let me know if they sound familiar to you. Well, Abraham, Adam, Moses, Jesus, Isaac, Ishmael.
Well, maybe. I don't think so.
I'll have to go back to you. I'll draw on your Catholic roots. How about Mary?
I think it depends on which Mary there is.
Yeah, okay, so Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Mary, mother of Jesus, yes.
Yeah. So these are all names from the Quran. They're all names within the Quran because the Quran is the third book. It's a trilogy. So within the Quran, you've got all the stories of the other two previous religions. And what brings these three traditions together is the idea of monotheism. Monotheism meaning there is one God, only one God. Why does that matter? Because back in the ancient times in Arabia, it was all about polytheism, meaning multiple gods. So there was all this kind of idol worship and all kinds of crazy, crazy stuff going on. And the idea that Abraham, as this prophet, he came to bring the message from God that there is only one God. And you only worship one God. You don't kind of have all these other different gods going on, what have you. So that was the message of Abraham, and that was reinforced by Moses, which was reinforced by Jesus, which was reinforced by the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran. So Islam is a world religion. It is a monotheistic religion, and it follows in the tradition of Judaism and Christianity. So Muslims believe, to be a Muslim, you must believe in Christianity and you must also believe in Judaism. Killing of an innocent human is as if you've killed the whole of humanity in Islam. And if you save a life in Islam, that's considered that you've saved the whole of humanity. So this idea that it's perfectly fine for Muslims to just, it's just an invitation, the Quran is an invitation for them to go out and kill or blow up people in a cafe, or as of course we've seen tragically this week in Lower Manhattan, some guy hiring a pickup truck and mowing down 8 people, on a footpath in Lower Manhattan. There's nothing in Islam that sanctions any of that at all. And so, it is a world religion that follows in the tradition of the other two great monotheistic religions. There is no sanctioning of killing Christians. There is no sanctioning of killing Jews at all. In fact, there's a verse in the Quran, it's chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, ayat, surah meaning chapter, ayat meaning verse, verse 256, where it very clearly states there is no compulsion in religion. It's in black and white, it's very, very clear. There are some verses in the Quran that are very poetic and metaphoric. There are some that are extremely contextual, that you cannot take one verse out of context with the others, otherwise there's no point in ever having the verse in the first place. And then there are others that are quite literal in that sense. There is no compulsion in religion. So the Quran was handed down at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. He used to meditate in a cave, and when he was 40 years of age, he was in this particular cave that he used to meditate in, and he had this revelation by the Archangel Gabriel, which of course is familiar in Christianity and also Judaism. Anyway, this idea of Archangel Gabriel coming to him, which was the same, according to the traditions, the same angel that came to Mary to advise that she was incarnate, or that she was pregnant with, Jesus, as the teachings go. Anyway, so over a 23-year period, the Prophet Muhammad had these revelations that would come to him in these visions. And as soon as he had these visions, he would tell his Sahaba means his friends, his group of friends, and they would scribe it down immediately. That's what's quite different to the Bible, where there's various different interpretations of the Bible and the stories, whereas the Quran is the Quran. So what was written 1400 years ago is exactly the same as what you'll see today. There has been no change to the Arabic, the classical Arabic, which is a language called Fusha, which is like old Arabic. So there's been no change to that at all. Where it differs, and this takes us into modern day issues of interpretation, is in fact in that context, the interpretation of these verses. Because if someone's objective or intention is to have peace and be a decent human being, to be a humanitarian, then they're going to read into this. And if it seems like it's quite barbaric, they're going to think, this is not really making sense. How can I better understand this? Some people are saying it says there that it's okay to beat a woman. How can that be the case? I think I better explore this. I'll try and find an answer to this. And then when you go further and you dig deeper into all of this, you realise that it's not referring to beat at all, it's referring to separate. But if I'm someone who has very puritanical ideas, I am politically motivated, and I've got an axe to grind, then I'm going to see that how I like. It's only the perverse of heart who will read these things in a way that's going to be really divisive. So the Quran itself is inherently flexible for those minds that are not inherently inflexible or fundamentally inflexible. So this is really important when we understand it. So the Arabic is always the same, no matter what Quran you'll ever pick up, but where you'll see differences are in the translations, especially when you're trying to translate a language like Fusha into modern day English, where there are words, I mean, we can try and do this right now with Greek, for example. If you look at some words in Greek, or any language for that matter, there is no direct translation into English. There is no word for that in English. It's the same thing that applies to a language that was written 1400 years ago. Trying to translate that into modern day English, it's going to be problematic. And if you've got a political axe to grind, you're going to read it however you like. And so that unfortunately underpins a lot of the extremist narrative that we see, and that extremist narrative has its roots in very puritanical ideas that at various points in history, in Islamic history, have been driven by individuals, not whole groups, but individuals who at those times were completely discounted by every other Muslim tribe at the time. I'm referring to Wahhabism now. Wahhabism has been around since the mid-1700s in the area that we now know as Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia became Saudi Arabia in 1932 because the Brits allowed for the Saudi family to have this land, which was otherwise under the control after the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans ran that area of the Arabian Peninsula. So the Brits overthrew them in the 1920s, and then by 1932 the Brits gave that area to the Saudi family because of the strong relationships that they had dealing in arms, and they needed disharmony, they needed divide and conquer in the region for their own purposes. The only way they could truly have divide and conquer is if all of the tribes on those lands didn't get along with each other. Because before that, there was relative harmony. Other than, the odd tribal conflict and things like that, there was relative harmony among those tribes. 99%, as I said, of those tribes in that particular region discounted Muhammad Abdul Wahab, who was that's the prayer call now, if you can hear.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of people discounted this guy. And in fact, he had family members who travelled as far as Egypt to discount this lunatic brother that they had. And they're like, this is not, we're so sorry, this is not Islam, this is not, we just disassociate ourselves from him. He's lost his mind. But this really puritanical, extremist interpretation of Islam was really needed to overthrow the whole region. And so the Brits needed that to take control of the entire region, to have control, and also by that stage oil was being found and all this kind of stuff. So they needed arms deals, because that's worth a lot of money, and they also needed the oil. So there were a lot of reasons that started to flourish right across the 20th century that lead us to the situation that we're in now, where that very extreme interpretation of Islam, which was originally discounted, as I said, by all other Muslims, that has now been a great export from Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, right across the world. So this extremist narrative has been picked up and used on top of political ideologies, to drive political ideologies. So the unfortunate reality of what we're seeing with terrorism in the name of Islam, I would challenge that. I would say there's nothing in the name of Islam, because Islam doesn't sanction any of that. It's Islamism. We need to see Islamism in the same way that we would see fascism, for example. So it's risen to prominence over the last 100 years because of foreign policy and ideologies, political ideologies, that have come to play. And now we're living in a situation where you've got, here in Australia, for example, you've got people who don't fit in, people who are told that they don't fit in. You've got disenfranchised youth who, doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, this is an issue for Victorian Police, for example, which is a group that I work with a lot when it comes to Islamic communities. If you are unhappy and you don't have a sense of belonging and you feel like you don't fit in, you are a prime candidate for doing something and joining some kind of a culture that's really not in the positive mindsets of a harmonious society. In the case of someone who could potentially be radicalised from an Australian context, our issues are much different to what you might see in other countries, perhaps around Europe, because they have historical issues to consider in the fallout of World War I and World War II in terms of failed migration patterns. And then, of course, there's a very different interpretation of terrorism right across the Middle Eastern region as well, and also going down into the Asia-Pacific region too. So every region has its own political issues, and when you layer on top of that discord, issues, then you layer on top of that the potential to be radicalised. It's very real. There are certain characteristics in an individual who is not fitting in, that is seeking to belong. You're angry with your society. You're angry when you turn the news on of a night time and you see Pauline Hanson, for example, rocking into Parliament in a what's called a niqab, although we call it burqa in the popular narrative, making a mockery of herself, making a mockery of the Australian Parliament, but also, basically playing dress-ups and pointing the finger at a particular group of individuals. Now, it's a perfectly fine debate to be having. Should we or should we not ban the face covering? That's fine. But to behave in certain ways and for the media to cover Islam and Muslims in a particular way, and for a young guy who is second or third generation who doesn't feel like they're fitting in, they're not really digging what's going on in the home, they're not fitting in at school, they jump on public transport, and there's issues there. You turn the TV on of a night time, there's all this constant barrage of anti-Islamic sentiment. That is a young guy who is the real potential candidate for groups called Daesh, otherwise known as Islamic State. So, and there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of other reasons as to why groups like Daesh have come to be in this day and age. Again, it gets back to understanding history, particularly modern history, probably even more so going back to the 2003 American occupation of Iraq. Some others would call it the invasion of Iraq. And the decisions that were made under Paul Bremer, who was appointed by Bush at the time, to be behind the so-called reconstruction efforts. There were 100 orders that he put in place, one of which was to disband the Iraqi military. So overnight, quite literally in the May of 2003, 250,000 Iraqi military lost their jobs. So if you think about Ansett, just going back before to our part one of this, there was 11,000 people who lost their jobs. Or if we think about the coal-fired station that's closing down in Victoria, or we think about any of the automotive plants, whether it be Ford or Toyota or something like that, and all the jobs that are lost there, there's a big impact on community. We'll try 250,000 military overnight by the Americans who have come in with so-called reconstruction efforts. You have to ask yourself, well, where did those people go? So thus starts to create a picture of the situation. So you've got that on one hand. There are other things that happened under Bremer. There was an Order 81, which was a patent that he introduced that meant that Iraqi farmers were not allowed to trade in their own seeds anymore. They weren't allowed to trade, they weren't allowed to plant, and they weren't allowed to share their seeds. In place of this law, in place of this, and you're talking about a culture that has been perfectly fine with agricultural farming for thousands of years. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You've got the Tigris and the Euphrates, as I said, two absolutely outstanding river systems. So much agriculture that has sustained over thousands of years. So, of course, under Order 81, under Paul Bremer, Iraqi farmers were not allowed to trade with each other anymore. So that's more or less a harvest let it go. So you're not allowed to sell your seeds. You're not allowed to plant any more of your seeds or anyone else's seeds, and you're not allowed to share them. Instead, Dow Corning, who provided all the chemicals for the fertilisers, Monsanto providing the genetically modified seeds, and Cargill, who was another big American agricultural firm, those three came in their place. So now, still to this day, that patent law is in place. Iraqi farmers are not allowed to trade between one another with seeds. You must use the American sources. So you must use the genetically modified seeds. You must use Dow Corning chemicals. And you must use Cargill as well. So when you understand the collapse of communities and cultures and societies and the impact that has, you start to understand, and how they do that. So it's not just about having troops on the ground. It's about what they do when they get in there. So, and it wasn't just the Iraqi military, it was teachers, hospitals, it was everybody, more or less, losing their jobs. So you basically get rid of a whole culture of people. You have ongoing resentments that build. What does this have to do with Islam? Nothing. What does this have to do with Muslims? Nothing. What does this have to do with the ongoing avalanche of fuel that feeds the Islamism narrative? Everything. So if we go back to my point that I made before about the distinction between Islam as a world religion, Islamism as a political ideology that's risen in prominence over the last 100 years, like fascism, for example, we start to understand how extremist rhetoric and how radicalisation has come to be a thing in 2017. Is it Islam and Muslims? No. Is it politics? Yes. Is it ignorance? Absolutely. Because there's no way that a Muslim who knows their faith could be radicalised. It's not possible. If they understand the true teachings of what Islam is as one of the great Abrahamic traditions, and understanding context, and understand the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, his sayings and his actions, the way he lived his life, then there's absolutely no way that a Muslim could be radicalised. So ignorance is really, really, really important. And whilst it's vitally important that the non-Muslim community understand all of this, so that we don't see this ongoing othering, because it's the othering and the divisions of society that these extremist lunatics want. They need that because that's part of what they radicalise people with. You know that these people hate you. You know your government hates you. You know that you don't fit in here because they don't want you to fit in. You know you don't belong. We will give you a reason for being. We will give you this. We will give you that. And they promise all of these things. You know, and then of course when so many of them get over there, there's absolutely no way you can get out. So it's worse than anything that they could possibly even ever have dreamt about in their worst nightmares. So delivering programs or delivering the idea of belonging, identity and inclusion, understanding Islam, it's not just a vitally important conversation that needs to be had in the mainstream popular narrative, in media, in politics and across the general diaspora. It also needs to be had within the Muslim community. Because if these conversations were being had among Muslims and Muslims felt a sense of identity, a sense of agency, keeping in mind, my question is, who speaks for Muslims? It's not Muslims. It's Sonia Kruger. Or it's Donald Trump. Or it's Corey Bernardi. It's Pauline Hanson. It's all of these voices of resistance against Islam and Muslims. And then when you see Islam and Muslims who are given some airtime, who may turn around and say, oh, it's okay to beat women and stuff like that, this is a lunatic opinion. That the vast majority of Muslims are just absolutely mortified when they see something like this on TV. Or you see someone that says, oh yeah, you know, I'd like polygamy, I'd like this, I'd like that. Well, they're going against the very teachings of Islam, because one of the key aspects of Sharia actually means pathway to a watering well. That's what the word Sharia means. So anyone who understands the 8 key principles of Sharia, which are all about preservation of humanity, anybody who understands that an aspect of that is that you respect the land that you live in and you respect those laws. And there is nothing within Australian law or Australian constitution that means that an Australian Muslim can't live comfortably and live their faith. And it's the same in the United States. There's nothing in our constitution that goes against Islam. And any Muslim who might be coming in here and saying, oh, you know, I'm going to have more than one wife, that's against the law. So that should therefore be taken before the law. And any Muslim who understands their deen, which is the word for faith in Islamic terminology, would understand that and would respect that. So education is really, really important. And it's really hard across the board, whether you're talking about Muslim groups or non-Muslim groups, because the popular narrative speaks volumes. And this is why I think we're also seeing people moving away from religion in general. I mean, you know, that's happening. I think I read a study that was looking at projecting forward to 2050 here in Australia, and they said that we're still going to have, I think, roughly 46% of Australians who align with Christianity, 40-something% align with no religion at all, and the other ones fall behind that. So there is a real shift toward agnosticism or atheism, which is absolutely fine. And with the popular narrative of anti-Muslim sentiment, what we're seeing are Muslims who are in a state of crisis about their own belief systems. Anytime an attack happens, you get collective guilt. Muslims who jump on the train thinking, God, you know, what am I going to face today? It's really interesting, because I said to a colleague of mine at the not-for-profit who is Buddhist, and just out of curiosity, I said to her, hey Mulan, how do you feel about the people who say that they're Buddhist and they're committing these atrocities or genocide against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar? How do you feel about that? She said, oh, it's got nothing to do with me, it's not my Buddhism. Well, that's what Muslims should have the confidence to say. That's what Muslims want to say. But it's not acceptable by the masses of non-Muslims, because they're to blame. But the irony in all of this, Julian, is that the vast majority of people who are dying are Muslims. The vast majority of people who are dying because of so-called Islamic extremism are Muslims. And groups like IS, so-called Islamic State, groups like them, the way that they get around this, because they're the ones killing them all, they say, well, they're not real Muslims, or they're not real Christians, or they're not real Jews, because Jews and Christians are protected people. They're considered people of the book in the Quran. And if you kill a Muslim life, the justice for that is exactly the same as if you've killed a Christian or a Jew. So there is no weight given to the life of a Muslim over the life of a Christian or a Jew. So all of these things are very, very important aspects that don't exist in the popular narrative. There is just one narrative, and that is the Orientalist narrative in a 2017 version, and that is that we will talk about who Muslims are. We will decide who Muslims are. We, as white folk as well, will decide what Australian values are, despite the fact that 50% of our population in our last census are either born outside of Australia or have a parent at least born outside of Australia. But white people, this kind of moral hegemony that exists in the sphere of what it is to be white, still reigns supreme in terms of these discussions. So Islam and Muslims is unfortunately still not part of a narrative that helps to explain who Islam and Muslims are in a 2017 world, unfortunately.
On the terms of classic fake news, just as a whole, especially for Muslims in particular, but also for journalism, how does the whole entire idea of it just detract anything good from any of the communities of journalists or Muslims? I mean, I can imagine it's just the worst thing to listen to, especially Trump saying this is fake news or that's
well, it's really predictable. Actually, I have to say, after what's just happened this week in Lower Manhattan, within 24 hours, I was actually really surprised to see some CNN coverage that was actually basically running with the headline saying Trump's predictable response. And I was like, wow. Because that's certainly something that you'd hear probably from many people now, because I think we're familiar with Trump's rhetoric now. So we're familiar with how he's going to do all of this. But for CNN to have jumped straight onto that, I was watching France 24. I tend to source France 24 for international issues because they tend to be more advanced in their analysis, probably for a number of reasons. Well, they're based in Paris anyway, but also they have access to very good thinkers. They've got a much greater pool of excellent thinkers that they can have on a panel in a very short period of time, and you can have a really interesting higher level discussion as to why this is happening. Whereas here in Australia, unfortunately, we have a much smaller cohort of very good thinkers who are able to engender a deeper level of understanding. And also we don't really have an audience that's able to jump on board and understand, in the morning news, to the same extent as what you would see in France or London, for example, or even in the United States as well, in some very credible news sources there. So, yeah. But it's very interesting the way fake news has managed to become a thing. And the way Trump has used fake news has become a thing as well, to justify his own behaviours, his own decisions, his own defence, trying to defend himself. The idea of alternative facts, in relation to how many people were actually at his inauguration. When the images were there, we saw that. Everybody knew that it was pretty sparse in comparison to Obama's numbers when he had his inauguration. But of course, his media manager, she turned around and she said, well, that's alternative facts, which just fueled the mainstream media even more. But Stanford University, who do some fantastic work around psychology and social psychology, they've recently done some fantastic analysis around the psychology of fake news and how on earth did we get to this point. And what they found in 3 separate studies is that they found that if we see ourselves as a species, as an animal, as the human animal, and we are constantly evolving as a species. We as a human species and our process of cognitive functioning has not evolved fast enough to keep up with the need to reason and make sense of all of the information that we are now exposed to through social media. So it's not like we're going home and it's just linear watching or linear listening on the radio. We go home at night time and watch TV and it's a 6 o'clock news or it's whatever. So we have to go by time frames. And back in the day when SBS used to, or Channel 2, used to switch off at like 11 o'clock at night or something, and then it was just like, you know, a static screen for hours until 6 a.m. or whatever. Everything is 24 hours now. And the speed of information is instant. It's instantaneous. So how do we make sense of all of this information coming at us all the time? So Stanford found that we don't make sense of it. We go into almost like the fight or flight response when there's too much information. We just don't know what to do when we are hit with all this information. And this reptilian brain that we have, if we haven't trained our brain to just stop and make sense of the rubbish from the gold. Let me make sense of what is actually going to be useful information and factual information and analyse that and make good of that versus the fake news or the rubbish that's out there, and there's obviously a whole lot of that. If we haven't learnt the skills in doing that, which is the vast majority of people, we go into this fight or flight space. So we're not able to reason with it, so therefore all we require are 3 qualifiers. So if one person turns around and says, yeah, you know, Muslims are terrorists, you're like, well, they might be, but I'm really not sure. And then a second person says, well, no, I reckon they are too. All Muslims are terrorists. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, okay, but maybe not though. And a third person, because all you need are 3. If a third person does it, you're like, okay, well, that's enough for me. I agree with you. So this gets back to the way our minds function. How do we respond to an oversupply of information, whether it's true or whether it's not, is in fact not the point at the time, because you simply haven't developed the cognitive reasoning process to be able to meet all of that information. You can't meet all of that information. So you go into that fight or flight and you just go with the dominant stimuli that you're receiving. And that's enough. And so you'll just go with the fake news. So that's why it's having such a profound effect on us. Perhaps if we were to have this conversation in 10 years' time, it might be really interesting to see how we as a species and how we have responded to all of this news and information, misinformation. I believe in physics. I believe in the laws of physics. For every action, there's an equal reaction. So for all of this rubbish that we're exposed to, and all of this fake news, and all the hate, and all the kind of stuff that we see out there, I do truly believe that there is an equal reaction of people who are saying, no, hang on, I don't really get it, but I want to know. I don't believe that we're just all going to hell in a handbasket, and we're all just these stupid lemmings, and we can't think for ourselves. I reject that idea. I believe that we need to ask the questions, and I believe that we all have the capacity to ask the questions if we are able to deal with fear, false evidence appearing real. So the idea that the media keeps perpetuating this idea that a terrorist attack is going to happen, it's imminent and everything, and whilst that may very well be the case, and whilst that is the case, we know the chances of us being attacked in a terrorist attack or something like that happening is so much lower than domestic violence. 73 Australian women died last year in domestic violence cases across the country. That's more than one a week. So therefore one must ask themselves, well, where's the fear, where's the threat there? Well, just stand on your front porch and look down your street, because it's potentially somewhere down there, which is much greater than the threat of Islamic extremism affecting you or your family. At the moment, the TAC statistics are around 134 people who've already died on the roads here in Victoria this year. Last year it was around 260 something. This is a predictable threat. We know it's going to happen. We actually know it's going to get higher over the course of 2017. We know it's going to happen. It's a predictable threat. Are we worried about it? No. I'm more worried about Islamic extremism. What's the chances? Pretty much nothing. But it's an unpredictable threat. An unpredictable threat and fear, false evidence appearing real, puts us in a position where we're extremely uncertain and we feel very insecure. When something is unpredictable, our certainty levels are very low. So when the unpredictability is high, our certainty is low. The more educated we become, the lower the unpredictability, the higher the stability and security and the sense of certainty. We know this for a fact because the ANU last year, the Australian National University, did a study on fear last year, particularly to do with Islam and Muslims. And what they found is that the higher the level of educational qualification, the lower the level that people believed there was going to be a potential threat on them, their family, or Australian society. So we do know that the more educated we become, and rather than seeing this from an elitist perspective, oh, you must be educated at a university, no. It's about understanding something more and having a greater understanding of something. And the greater our understanding of something, the lower our fear. The higher our understanding, the higher our fear. And this gets back to the very beginnings of our discussion about Islam and Muslims, and in my experience living across Islamic nations, right across the Middle Eastern region, and travelled extensively in Indonesia and Malaysia, Indonesia being the most populous Muslim nation in the world, 202 million, I think I said earlier. By and large, they're beautiful people. Beautiful, respectful, dignified, clean, honourable, family-orientated, socially conscious people. They're wonderful, wonderful people. They're nothing like what we see in the media. And we have so much more in common as humans and in our humanness and our human values than differences. But we don't have the opportunity to focus on all of these. And with the tiniest little bit of education, we start to see these similarities. And also when we hear personal stories, when we humanise one another, we can empathise with one another. But when we dehumanise, then we can do anything we want. Look at the Holocaust. So to address the ongoing issues that we're seeing across society, really the only way to address Islamic extremism and to address what these horrendous criminals are doing around the world is to understand one another and to embrace, as you would know from being a very good student in global media industries, we understand that cosmopolitanism, or to be a cosmopolitan, is a very important thing. Cosmopolitanism now really being the next new term on the block, superseding that of multiculturalism. So to be a cosmopolitan, especially in a city like Melbourne, we recognise, how fabulous is Chinatown? How great is Lygon Street? And then all these great places, great parts. Sydney Road, fantastic. Some of the best Arabic food down there, So we as a society are so, we're just all these different flavours. We're kind of like a minestrone soup. And that minestrone soup together is really tasty. It's really yum. That's what a cosmopolitan is. You recognise that there's all of these differences, but it's in fact all of those differences that make us great, that make us fabulous. It makes it an interesting place to be. And if we can embrace that way of thinking, that is one of the greatest tools to national security. It's also one of the greatest tools in combating radicalisation as well. Because if you allow someone to have a sense of belonging and allow them to have a sense of agency, to speak for themselves as what it is to be, a Muslim, then you're allowing them to be a part of the widestream narrative, the mainstream narrative. And that enables a greater sense of social harmony and progress as a nation. And by and large, Muslims are relatively well educated as a group. And in fact, Pew and Gallup did a study recently, and what they found in the United States, in the US case, 40% of American Muslims are college educated. And that compares to 29% of the general American diaspora being college educated. So we're talking about police officers, we're talking about surgeons, we're talking about legal professionals, we're talking about educators, we're talking about politicians. And they're very much a part of Australian culture. So to enable Muslims to be a part of the Judeo-Christian Islamic culture that we're part of, not just the Judeo-Christian, to allow them to be a part of the discussion of what it is to be an Australian is a very, very important move.
I think lastly we'll touch on Australia as a multicultural society, because I find it such a great irony when people are saying like overseas, are saying like, oh, Australia is full of like they're kind of racist towards us in a way, saying that we're racist people, and that like we're the stereotypes of, you know, oh, we have our pet kangaroos and stuff like that. But then on like when you look at Australians, and we're like, well, we're actually multicultural. Like we've got like next door to me, I've got Asian opera singers. On the other side, I've got hippies that aren't like really bad people, but like, you know, I don't even know if I can. Is it bad to call someone a hippie? It's just like the kind of person that they are.
I thought it was cool at one point.
But yeah, I mean, like I just find it interesting that people say like that Australia is a racist country, even though it's so multicultural. But then I guess people in Australia, to a decency, I mean, I think everyone to a decency is racist, like depending on how aware of it that they are and how aware of the people that they are. Yeah, and I mean, I have a friend who literally calls Muslims terrorist Muslims. They don't even care if they're not. I'm like, but they're not. It's just such an argument. I'm like, they're not terrorists though.
I would say in Australia we have a high level of low-level racism. Is Australia any different to any other country? I don't think so. If you look at South Africa, for example, with apartheid, or you look at countries that have very strict rules around foreigners and residency visas, like for example in the United Arab Emirates, Abu Dhabi being the capital, Dubai, of course, everybody knows Dubai. As a foreigner, if you're a non-Emirati, you're never going to have permanent residency there. You'll never be able to retire there. Only Emiratis can live there permanently, despite the fact that there are generations of people who have been born there and have to keep coming in and out, who are perhaps of Indian origin or something of that nature. So I think countries all around the world are inherently conscious of differences. I think that there has been this idea of white skin being the supreme dominant race. We're still very much living in that. We're living in the fallout of that. There's been some great comedy. Nazim Hussain, Fear of a Brown Planet, you know, talking about brown skin and all this kind of stuff, and actually, you know, looking at it from a very satirical aspect. So trying to use comedy to challenge, you know, the racism that we see.
Which kind of is an Australian value in itself. We use satire to talk about big things.
Absolutely, absolutely. And comedy works. I mean, self-deprecation works. I think we're living in a very challenging time though, in terms of the rising up of the extremes. So whether you want to call it, in the American instance, the alt-right, after we saw what happened recently with people dying over there, by a so-called alt-right guy mowing down people. The way it's covered in the media, obviously the Vegas shooting, this was a really normal white guy who, you know, came from a decent family and, you know, he'd only ever had one parking ticket ever and blah, 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 blah. He was a really nice guy and he lived in a retirement village in Nevada. Listen to all this backstory we get about this white guy who did a shooting. The minute this thing happened in Lower Manhattan this week, it was immediately called terrorism. Many could argue that, well, 57, 59 people that died in Vegas, you could call that terrorism too. What is terrorism? What's the difference between a shooting and terrorism? You know, this guy immediately was a Muslim, immediately was about Islam. IS immediately claimed responsibility for it, or claimed an association to it. Now this is also something that they do to make them appear bigger than what they actually are. And as we all know in recent times that they're almost gone now. But there's this appropriation. So, you know, there's a lot of jokes within the Muslim community that, oh, you know, IS would claim responsibility for the tipping over of a fruit bowl. You know, they like to do this. They like to associate. In fact, they did try to associate themselves with the Vegas shooter, which was great because obviously the FBI immediately turned around and put that one to bed very, very quickly, saying that that's not the case at all. But I think, unfortunately, because of these perceptions, we do have some significant issues here in Australia. A study was done earlier this year in 2017 that looked at Islamophobia as an aspect of racism and Islamophobic attacks. 78% of Australian Muslim women have been the subject of attacks in public. That would be those women who do choose to wear the hijab or the headscarf. 78%. 30% of those women had their children with them. Only 1 in 4 bystanders stood in to combat that. The attacks peak, although there's a real spike in attacks after media coverage. And unfortunately, the unfortunate reality is that the perpetrators are usually white males. So these are all measurable now. So we know that that's what we're living with here in Australia, unfortunately, at this point in time. So the law enforcement agencies are they're very much onto this. They're doing a huge amount of work to try and understand these communities. In fact, in my not-for-profit role, I do a lot of work with law enforcement in these education programs, helping them to understand and to understand community and to bring about harmony in the best possible way. But I think, unfortunately, it is getting worse. But whilst it's getting worse on one hand, the number of individuals who are asking the questions, who are simply not prepared to be a part of what we historically, as media professionals, or anyone who studied media would have heard of the hypodermic needle. Yeah, so, this idea that came out of Marxist theory, this idea that we are just fed information and there's nothing we can do about it. It's kind of weird. I have this feeling that we've actually almost gone back to that because of the oversupply of information that is at us. So we're not able to make reason of anything, going back to the Stanford studies that I meant earlier. So therefore, it's just information at us, and that of course leads to this ongoing effect of othering or racism, the rising up of the far right, and the equal reaction by extremism of the other side as well. But within all of that, I do believe that there is an increasing cohort of really wonderful thinkers and a growing number of wonderful thinkers around the world who are simply saying, nah, it's not working for me. There's got to be more to the story. So you have to have faith. You have to have faith in our human values and in the intelligence of people. I think if we lose that faith, then we lose the ability to encourage and support one another, and that will play into an ongoing narrative of othering, which is only going to make things worse. The only way to make it better is to bring together and understand that coming together really is a tool for national security as well. But we're all up against it. So that, therefore, it's people like yourself, anyone who watches your videos, anyone who is educated, anyone who's not educated, who actually has the capacity to say, hang on, is that fair, what they've said there? Is that right, what they said there? I mean, I know last week, the Channel 7's morning program were talking about how Prince Harry had been a target of IS. Well, there's plenty of Australian Muslims who have also been a target of IS as well. Many, many Australian Muslims who do a huge amount of work in the community to build harmony and to build understandings, who have also been targeted. But that doesn't make news, does it? So I think it's important that we call the media out on these things, that we do demand a better output of media. And when we do hear from Muslims who might turn around and say, well, you know what, Islam is the most feminist religion for me. Well, let someone say that. If that's what she thinks, then let her say it. Why can't she say it? Because she's Muslim. And she's not allowed to own the narrative of what it is to be a Muslim. Only a white non-Muslim is allowed to talk about what is Islam. So we need to combat that by going back to our human values that are consistent and afforded to all of us. It doesn't matter what colour your skin is. but to grant that respect to one another and to think, just to stop and think, is it right, is it fair, does it make sense, does it sound truthful? And if it doesn't, it's probably not. And to feel comfortable enough to be able to follow that way of thinking, despite if your friend turns around and says, oh, terrorist Muslims. They know that that's not the right thing to say. And often we need to understand as well that people like to have a reaction. They like to create reactions as well, which actually gets back to them being relevant and having a sense of belonging and having an impact. So, I guess we just have to pick and choose those times where we do actually engage. I wouldn't engage with someone who just calls them terrorist Muslims unless there was a very real reason to need to engage in that. But I would probably take that as provocative for the reasons of being provocative and not for social cohesion's sake.
Yeah, well now I can just show them this and be like, shut up.
Yeah.
Learn something.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll just check if I have anything left. No, that's all. Cool. Alright, well, thanks for being on the show, Jessica.
No worries, Julian.
And thanks for watching. There'll be again links to your LinkedIn and your Twitter down below. God, I have a feeling whenever I'm listening to someone just so intensely, my whole brain goes numb.
Yeah.
It's I don't.
Brain explodes. Brain explode moment.
If I move, I feel like I'll just fall over. I'm it's just such a focused state. But
I think just in summary, the world that we live in is this just amazing, complex world of agreements and disagreements, and there's many things. And when you're talking about race and colour and religions and stuff like that, these are topics that are inherently fraught with disagreements. So the idea that there's going to be a day where we all wake up and the world is going to be at peace, that's unrealistic. So I think it's important that being, especially from a democratic country where you have a right to your opinion, we need to be having these conversations. And we need to respect each other's views, whether we agree with them or not. I think it's important that we do respect those views and have these conversations in a respectful way. Because I think it's when we do engage in respectful conversations where we can say, look, I respectfully disagree with you because of da-da-da-da. That's important because people's opinions matter. And I think as a human species, the only way that we're going to evolve in a productive way is if we enable those conversations that never come to an end. We just have to begin the conversation and then just keep having the conversations. So, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks for having this conversation.
Yeah, it's been great. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for watching the conclusion to this two-part interview with Jessica Swann. Today we discussed Muslims, terrorism, Islam, and fake news. If you want to watch more of that interview show, there'll be a link to the playlist down below. Otherwise, you can like, share, and subscribe for more. And if you haven't watched the first part, there'll also be a link to that in the description below. Goodbye.